It's great, isn't it, just to be able to take time to fix our eyes on Jesus, on who he is, and the way he wants to work in our lives, and his heart for us is just so beautiful. We don't always kind of feel it, though, do we? We know it, but we don't always feel it. How many of you can be honest and you can say you've ever had what you would call a hard day? If there's a hand not up, then I think you're probably deceived, but there we go. We have hard days for lots of reasons, don't we? Things don't go to plan in the way that we'd intended that they would, and everything kind of seems to become a bit of a struggle and a battle just to kind of get things done, or maybe we're not feeling well. Maybe somebody does something to us. Everything's going great, and then somebody says something or does something, and it just hits us like a ton of bricks. Maybe we make a really bad choice, and we have to face the consequences of it. There's a whole host of different reasons that days can be hard. And yet that's not what any of us want, is it? We all want good days. One of the things that Jesus says in the verses that we're going to be looking at today, in John 10:10, is he says that he came that we might have life and life to the full. That we might have the best life, that we might have abundant life. And I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty good to me. The problem is, or one of the problems at least, is that there are so many different things in our world that kind of hold out that promise, aren't there? That if you do this, or you stop that, if you buy this thing, or you start this diet, then you will begin to experience your best life. I imagine most of you have tried something like that at some point. You kind of bought into the advertising. I know I have before in different ways. And, some things can be really helpful. I'm not saying all of it's rubbish. Some of it can be really helpful. Some of it can be good. But none of them solve everything, do they? They never quite live up to that promise that if you just have this, then you'll have your best life. So when we've been let down by so many other things, in a world full of advertising and grand promises, how can we trust Jesus to deliver on his promise? That he came that we might have life and life to the full. And the reason we can trust Jesus on his promise, especially, and it's a massive question, isn't it? Especially when it is that we all held our hand up a moment ago to say we've had hard days. How do those two things go together? And the reason that we can trust Jesus, we've been taking time recently to look at who Jesus says that he is. To look at the statements where Jesus said, I am. And the basis for Jesus' promise that he has come that we might have life and life to the full comes down to who he is. And we've already been kind of singing about it a little bit because he says, and the one we're going to be focused on today is that he says who he is, that I am. This is John 10, verse 11, right after the verse after he said that he's come to give us life and life to the full. He says, the reason you can trust this is because I am the good shepherd. And this imagery of being a good shepherd, it just kind of sounds a bit twee to us. It sounds really nice and kind of fluffy, and, you get this kind of cute little sheep and Jesus walking along with him. But this imagery for the people that Jesus was speaking to wouldn't have been twee. It would have been powerful, and it would have been familiar. And part of that is simply because, being a shepherd was something that they were used to. They would have sheep being brought into the town. They would, most of them, a lot of people would have owned a sheep or two themselves that they would have kind of trusted to shepherds to look after. It was a pretty common thing, so they were familiar with it in that way. But actually, even more than that, the reason that this language of being a shepherd was powerful and familiar was much deeper. You see, the Bible uses the language of sheep and shepherds all over the place. Comes up again and again. It is one of the primary pictures that it is used to try and describe our relationship with God, with us as the sheep and with God as the shepherd. And to give you a bit of background, before we kind of dig into really what Jesus is saying, I want to give you a bit of background so you can understand something of what the people that Jesus was speaking to would have had in their minds when he makes this statement, because I think it brings something of the deeper meaning out for us. You know, someone who the people Jesus was speaking to would have celebrated to such an extent that they kind of were longing for someone just like him to kind of come back again was King David. You know, and they had this great hope that there was going to be another kind of King David. And David, you know, he'd started out as a shepherd of the sheep before he'd become the king of Israel and effectively became the shepherd of a nation. And David writes one of the most kind of popular and beautiful passages of the Bible that it expresses how God is our shepherd. We've been singing it just a few moments ago. It's Psalm 23. And rather than me reading it, it's one of the verses that our kids have been learning recently. So I got Evan and Annabelle to do me a little favor yesterday. They put a little video together of them sharing it. So why don't you watch this instead?
Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Brilliant. They're a cute pair, aren't they? It's a beautiful psalm, isn't it, if you don't get distracted by the children. And, you know, it's a picture of our God as our shepherd. You know, the one who leads us and guides us, who brings us through dark times, the one who brings us peace, who refreshes us from the inside out, who refreshes our soul, who brings us life, the one who provides for us green pastures, who brings us to the place of abundance where we can have life and life to the full. You know, this is how God has designed for our relationship with him to be. But what happens is after David's written this psalm and the relationship between God and his people in the nation of Israel is the Jewish people turn their back on God. They don't listen to the voice of their shepherd. They choose to go their own way. And so they end up first as slaves in Babylon, and then in the time of Jesus, when Jesus is speaking these words, they are under the rule of the Roman Empire. They're oppressed by the Romans. And the way that the Jewish people kind of thought about this, the way that they spoke about it, is they talked about how it's like we're living as sheep without a shepherd. You know, and actually this is one of the ways that all of us are described when we live life apart from God. You know, Isaiah puts it this way in Isaiah 53, he says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us have turned to our own way." Now, we are designed to be in relationship with God as our shepherd. And life apart from God, you know, going our own way is like being sheep without a shepherd. And when sheep try and live without a shepherd, it never ends well. Another way, though, that the people Jesus was speaking to would have been familiar with using this kind of language of shepherds was not just about how things were designed to be in their relationship with God, but how God had designed things to be and intended things to be with the leaders within the nation of Israel. The role that they were meant to take. And the sad thing is that more often than not, the leaders of Israel were not good shepherds, but were selfish and unfaithful shepherds. Some verses that help us to kind of see this in Ezekiel 34. This is God speaking to Ezekiel, and he says this, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled over them harshly and brutally." So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains, and on every high hill they were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched for them or looked for them. God is saying the leaders of Israel have been selfish and unfaithful shepherds. And then we read on in verse 11 and 14. It says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord." Can you see the connection with Psalm 23? You know, that God has designed his relationship with his people to be like that of the sheep with the shepherd. But the sheep went astray. They went their own way. They suffered under bad leadership. And then this promise of God is that he will come again, and he will come for the sheep, and he will be their shepherd again. And so the Jewish people, when Jesus is speaking this, the Jewish people in the first century, they were longing for the fulfillment of this promise that God would come to be their good shepherd, to lead them out of this place of oppression into the place of good pasture, where they would get to experience life and life to the full. They were tired of living under bad leadership. Now, this is the background that helps us to understand what it really means when Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." I think it's the whole reason why he needs to put that word "good" in there. Because he's got to kind of differentiate himself to say, you know what, there are other people who are going to come along and try and be shepherds. And they're not good. Because the people have experienced what it is to be in the position of having selfish, unfaithful shepherds in positions of leadership, when they're actually meant to care for the people they're responsible for. I think this is what Jesus is talking about in John 10, verse 1. When he says, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees," and you've got to understand this is him talking to some of the leaders, "anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." He's saying that there are those of you who want to influence, you want to have influence over the sheep. You want that role of the shepherd, but you want it for your own selfish gain. That in this life, you know, when you and I, when we wander away from the good shepherd, you know, when we're those sheep that kind of go astray, do you know, we're not just left to our own devices. We like to think that it's like this. Either we've got this choice, you know, we can follow God and that's the way that we're meant to do things. But if we go our own way, you know, we'll make a few kind of bad choices. Things will, you know, whatever it is, but we'll have some fun along the way. You know, we miss the fact we're not just left to our own devices. That when we wander away from the good shepherd, we have a spiritual enemy. His name is Satan, and he hates God, and he hates God's people, and his mission is to steal, kill, and destroy everything that is close to the heart of God, which means you and me. You know, at the start, we pretty much all admitted that we have hard days sometimes, and you know, part of that is our own fault. Well, certainly is mine sometimes. Part of that is just a result of living in a broken world with broken people, and people hurt us and stuff happens. But part of that is because there is a thief and a robber. Because we have an enemy, because there is an evil in this world that is out to destroy. Jesus says the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But in contrast to that, in contrast to the selfish, unfaithful shepherd, the one who is going to give you false promises that are going to let you down, who's going to try and lead you astray with this kind of promise of life, but actually it's going to lead to a mess. In contrast to that, I'm the good shepherd, and I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And so the imagery here is that Jesus is the good shepherd, and we're the sheep. And that kind of imagery, when you stop and think about it, kind of puts us in our place, doesn't it? Because sheep can't survive on their own. They're entirely dependent on the shepherd. And just as the sheep need a shepherd, we need a Savior. Without him, we go astray. Without him, we get lost. We make bad decisions. And without him, we are vulnerable to the thief. We are vulnerable to the lies and the strategies of the enemy. You know, Jesus wants to be your good shepherd, to be intimately involved in your life. He wants to care for you personally, to lead you, to guide you into life and life to the full. So I want to look a little bit more at what Jesus says in John 10 and just pull out a couple of ways that Jesus wants to work in our lives as the good shepherd. And the main one, probably where I'm going to spend most of the time that I want to focus on, is how the good shepherd leads the sheep. You know, a key feature of the way a relationship's meant to work between the sheep and the shepherd is that the shepherd leads and the sheep follow. That the shepherd calls and the sheep hear and obey. This is what Jesus says in John 10, going from verse 2. He says, "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." You know, often we end up talking about how dumb sheep are. I know I've done it before, and, you know, kind of that whole kind of thing of, you know, well, sheep are dumb and so are we, all of that kind of stuff. But you know, one thing that's amazing about sheep, they learn and know their shepherd's voice. When I was preparing for today, I came across a little video which I thought was just a great way of illustrating this. As a shepherd in Norway does a bit of an experiment, and to show kind of, he gets a number of different people to come and try and call his sheep before he does. And why don't you watch what happens?
One more time.
Oh, one is.
Louder!
Look at them, look at them.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
They are coming. I can't believe it. This is amazing. One more. Just scared them.
Is that cool or what?
Do you know what's the number one job of a follower of Jesus? It's learning to listen to and follow the voice of the Good Shepherd. When we hear and we follow, we can be confident that we're going in the right direction and that He is leading us into life and life to the full. Here's the thing. You know, often, I don't know about you, when I've pictured this kind of idea of what's going on and what Jesus is talking about, the sheep pen that is there, I've kind of, pictured a single flock of sheep in this just random place, and the shepherd comes along and, kind of like we saw on the video. But what Jesus is talking about here, the kind of pen that had a gatekeeper, was a pen usually in the middle of a town where lots of different shepherds would come into the marketplace, so there'd be people all around, and the flocks would mix together in the sheep pen. And the shepherd would leave the sheep in with the gatekeeper. That's why he talks about how the shepherd comes to the gatekeeper and the gatekeeper lets him in and all of that kind of stuff that is going on. And so you'd have all of these different sheep mixed together. Multiple different flocks in this noisy, chaotic environment of the marketplace, and different shepherds at different times would all come in and kind of shout and call their sheep. And it's in that kind of a context that we see the shepherd calls the sheep by name. And they recognize his voice in the midst of the crowd, in the midst of the noise, and they come to him. And they follow him. And I think this captures something of the challenge that we face when it comes to hearing and following the voice of Jesus. Allowing the Good Shepherd to be the one who leads us. You see, we are surrounded by so many different voices, aren't we? There are so many places that we can look for guidance and advice. So many things that seem to hold out that promise of, this is the route to the best life. This is the quick fix. That it can be hard to know who or what to listen to follow. What to believe. From Google to social media to news outlets to just simply friends that we have around us. There are so many different voices, and we are constantly connected through them, through technology, through phones and tablets, through smart watches that we've got now. We're just constantly being connected to this bombardment of information and these voices and this contact which is there. And, it's not all bad. They might have something helpful to contribute, but it all adds to the noise. And it all makes it harder to hear the voice of the shepherd. Because it makes it so hard to kind of have that sense of quiet, to be able to focus in, Think about it this way. I imagine you've all had one of those kind of times where you've gone out for coffee with a friend and you sat at a table across from one another, and the cafe's full, it's noisy, and so it's really hard to hear what they're saying. And there's just all these different, you kind of catch this bit of a conversation. Oh, that sounds interesting. And then, you're trying to be pulled back in. And so what do you do? What do you do in that moment? You lean in, don't you? You lean in that moment in order to try and kind of focus on what they're saying and to kind of filter out all of the background noise. You lean in so that you can hear them better. so that you can give them your full focus. And if we don't do that in that conversation in the cafe, if we just kind of sit back in the chair, then we kind of find ourselves smiling and nodding and, trying to pretend and say yes at the right places, when really we've missed half of what it is that they're saying. And I want to suggest that sometimes when it comes to hearing the voice of the Good Shepherd, you need to lean in. Because what can happen is we're doing life with him. We've even carved out time to spend with him, almost like going to the cafe with a friend for the coffee at the table. We're kind of sat across from him. We've made that space to be with the Good Shepherd. But with our constant connection to all of these other voices, to this kind of noise that we're bombarded with all of the things we've got spinning around our head, the jobs that we need to do and all the rest of it, it's like we're surrounded by noise. And if we don't lean in, we're going to struggle to hear. And you might say, well, why doesn't God just speak louder? That's the other way. If I don't have to lean in, if he shouts over the noise, he can get my attention. And occasionally I think he's incredibly gracious and he does. But more often than not, he doesn't. Because what he really wants is for you to come closer. It's for you to be as close to him as you possibly can. As tuned into him and focused on him as we possibly can. And so the best thing that we can do, and it's not always easy, it takes discipline, is to carve out time when we simply stop. When we make space. Space in our diary is a good start, but space in our minds, space in our hearts. When we quiet the other voices, and we turn off the phone, and we pray and we ask the Good Shepherd to speak to us. It's to pick up and read the Bible, and when we do, to invite the Holy Spirit to make the shepherd's voice known to us through it. And as we take time in that way, little by little, we learn to know the shepherd's voice. As we lean in, we'll find it easier to hear. And what you'll find is that as he speaks to you, he's got words of encouragement for you, words to show you how valuable you are to him. He wants to speak into your heart his love for you. That he'll lead you to a place where those things that were filling your head that you were so concerned about, you don't need to worry about anymore. He'll lead you to a place of peace where anxiety and fear fallen to the wayside because you're able to just trust him. The Good Shepherd is always speaking. Sometimes we kind of cry out, God speak, and really what we're saying is God shout. Because he's always speaking. He's always calling out to the sheep to lead them to life and life to the full. And the best way that we can learn his voice is simply to, in your time, in the way you do things, choose to lean in. And I want to give you a really simple way. When sometimes, it's you're trying to work out and you've got this other voice in your head and you're trying to work things out and this voice is so loud and, knowing what's God's voice, what's not, in the midst of the different voice, I want to give you a really simple way to be able to know the difference between the voice of the Good Shepherd, the voice of Jesus, and the voice of the enemy. You see, the enemy's voice is always full of shame and accusation. It's the voice that says, you're a failure. You'll never be free. You're worthless. How could God ever love you? If people knew the real you, they wouldn't want anything to do with you. I don't know if you saw, there's something in that. Whenever the enemy speaks to you, whenever it's the enemy's voice, he might know your name, but he calls you by your sin. You're an addict. You're a liar. You're arrogant. You're a failure. You're broken. The Good Shepherd isn't like that. Jesus knows your sin, but he calls you by your name. He says, call my sheep by name. Come to me, Pete. Come to me, Sue. Come to me, David. Come to me. Jesus calls you by name. He chooses you. He loves you, and you are valuable to him. You are precious to him. And when you come to Jesus, you see, you are not defined by your sin. You're not defined by what you've done or what you've failed to do, by the hurts or the pain that you carry. You are defined by what Jesus has done for you. So I want you to understand this. The enemy, he knows your name, but he calls you by your sin. Whereas Jesus, he knows your sin, but he calls you by your name. And he leads you out of addiction, out of anger, out of hopelessness, and into life, and life to the full. Do you know the Good Shepherd's voice? Do you know his voice? And are you willing to follow? Because that's the number one priority of a sheep. They might be dumb. They might not be able to do much else, but they know their shepherd's voice. And they follow. If a sheep is going to thrive in life, they know that's what they need to do. They know that's the route to life and life to the full. And our number one priority as followers of Jesus is to be people who simply hear and obey. There's lots we could talk about. I want to just highlight one other thing that the Good Shepherd does. And that's that the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is what Jesus says. He goes on, this is John 10:11. We've started here, but I'll read on from it. He says, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. But then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. This is that sense again that there's other voices, there's other things that are going to promise us protection, promise us a way to life, but they'll let us down. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. These are these things which say if you buy into this system, or if you do this thing, but they just want your money, or they want your time, or they want your following. Jesus says, I'm not like that. He says, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. This is Jesus saying, I'm not just the good shepherd of the Jewish people, of this little group here, but of the whole world. I'm calling all people to me. If you don't know Jesus, then your good shepherd is calling out to you today, calling you to himself. And then he goes on, he says, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. The Good Shepherd will do everything that he can to provide for and to protect the sheep, even if it costs him everything. And as the Good Shepherd, Jesus wants to work in your life, in my life, to lead you to good pasture, to refresh your soul, to bring you healing, to provide for your deepest needs. And I want you to know today that if you have given your life to Jesus, I want you to know you are a sheep under the care of the Good Shepherd. That you are under his care, that this is his heart for you, that no matter what you face, no matter how you may feel, the Good Shepherd is with you. He will lead you, even if he's got to carry you, he will lead you towards life. He'll take care of you, he'll provide for you. And the most powerful way that we see Jesus put this into action is that he sees our greatest need. And out of his love for you, he chooses to meet it by laying down his life. He sees you, one of his precious sheep, having gone astray, stuck in the mud, filthy with sin, with the predator of death closing in. And in love, he sacrifices himself. He lifts us out of the muck. He washes us clean. He sets us free. He gives us life, even though it means laying down his life and dying in our place. He rescues us from guilt and shame and the greatest enemy of death itself. You know, the amazing good news that Jesus kind of begins to talk about in these verses to do with the good shepherd is that just as Jesus lays down his life of his own accord willingly out of love for the sake of us, so he takes it up again. That death cannot defeat him. He overcomes the grave. He rises again to life. He is alive today so that he is not just a good shepherd once ago in the past, but he is the good shepherd actively for us today. We can have a relationship with him. We can hear his voice calling to us so that we can allow him to lead us to life and life to the full. Not only now in this moment, but for eternity. John is calling out to you today. The Good Shepherd calls you by name and says, come to me. No, come closer. Come closer. Lean in so you can hear my voice, so that I can lead you into life and life to the full. Let me be your good shepherd and choose to follow me as a good sheep. You know, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to our own way. That's what Isaiah said, what we read earlier. You know, but the wonderful news is that as Isaiah goes on, the Lord has laid on him, on Jesus, the iniquity, the sin, the mistakes, the failures of us all, so that we can be rescued, so that we can be forgiven, so that we can be washed clean, so that we can be made new, so that we can have life and life to the full. I asked Tim and Sana to come up, and we're going to go into a time of communion. And if you're joining us at home and you've not got things ready, you might want to grab some bread and some juice. And you know, during this time, we're going to celebrate Jesus. We're going to celebrate the fact that he's our good shepherd, that he lays down his life for us, his sheep, so that we can have life. And that's something we want to celebrate and rejoice in. But I also want to encourage you to do two things during this time. I want to encourage you first to recognize the ways that you're a sheep that's gone astray. Confess them to God. Receive his forgiveness. And then commit yourself to be a good sheep. To be one who hears and obeys. To follow the voice of the shepherd. To follow Jesus. And the second is that I want to encourage you during this time to take it as a time to lean in. To choose to listen, to know that actually in this moment, even right now here, the Good Shepherd is speaking to you. He never stops speaking. He is speaking to you. He has new things that he is wanting to say into your heart that are specific for you. Lean in. Listen. Focus on Jesus. Ask the Holy Spirit to help you to be one who hears and obeys.